Here in the Green Mountains of Vermont, we print magazines. We're Lane Press, and we've been doing this since 1904. We don't print books, journals, or signs, just magazines. All of our equipment is made for that, and all of our craftspeople specialize in it. We print for prestigious colleges and universities, for business-to-business brands. We print regional, association, niche, and newsstand titles, and we would love to print your magazine. To learn more, visit us at lanepress.com.
It took about 6 months for us to actually know what to do with that magazine. We came in, we did a very quick redesign, and I think it took us a good few months to understand actually what we'd done and what we were doing. But because Bloomberg didn't have any institutional knowledge on how to do this, they just had the wherewithal to buy it and fund it. We were allowed to experiment in ways to think about that magazine in ways that the other publishers wouldn't have even considered.
Richard Turley is changing the idea of the magazine. Richard Turley has no idea what a magazine is in the year 2024, and in this sense, he's not so different from you or I. Richard Turley's magazines, and there are many, are confrontations, loaded with text or not, sometimes, but if you ask him, he's not sure what he's doing. He claims to be boring. He once said, "I'm a boring traditional formalist thinker," and he probably is, but you have to really know your stuff to get where he's coming from. Where Richard Turley is coming from is England. He got his start at The Guardian. He was then lured to New York to help revamp Bloomberg Businessweek. His work there made art directors everywhere ugly jealous. The secret to Richard Turley's work is the freedom it seems to exhibit. Free from form, from rules, from common sense, sometimes even from good taste, but only if you're stuck up, which Richard Turley is most definitely not. Richard Turley once claimed his design philosophy was to do something unlikable, repellent, horrible, and ugly. Richard Turley is punk in a way, but mainstream. He's underground adjacent, which just makes him even more punk. Richard Turley has worked at MTV and ad agencies. Richard Turley designed the logo for one of the world's largest sports. Richard Turley now runs his own creative agency and is the art director of Interview magazine, and co-created Civilization, and Nuts International, and Awful, and has designed a literary magazine, Heavy Traffic, and has just redesigned one of the most iconic magazines in existence. Which one? You'll have to listen to the podcast. But just remember this, Richard Turley is a busy man. I, however, am not Richard Turley, far from it. My name is Arjun Basu, and this is The Full Bleed. You are a busy guy, and you do 2 million things. I'm sure your time is precious. Let me ask you this before I get to some of your background, but were you hyperactive as a kid?
I think so.
Or not hyperactive, but just active. Were you overly active as a kid?
I don't think I was actually, no. I mean, I don't remember being. I think a lot of this kind of ADHD language has arisen in the last 10 or 15 years, and I on some level identify with it. I think I've probably become a little bit more tweaked, if you like. But I don't recall doing too much. But as my life has gone on, I think I have done more and more things, and probably I've now created a bit of kind of hyperactivity inside my brain. I would definitely now somewhat identify with being a bit ADHD, but maybe it's just phones and modern life has just spun me.
Maybe. You know? I would just say you're busy.
I'm definitely busy, 100% busy. And I think the busyness kind of creates a certain sort of hyperactivity around it and way of functioning when you are doing tons of things. So yeah, I do agree. I concur.
You concur. Thank you. So let's talk about everything, your education and everything leading up to your first big job, which I guess would be The Guardian. What got you into this?
A love of magazines, really. I'm 47, so I grew up in the late 90s, and magazines, music magazines, cultural magazines were the means of getting information and for finding out about scenes and cultural moments that were happening and bubbling up around you, and that was how you received information. And I think magazines for me back then, and maybe still a little bit today, had a flavor of the scenes that they were representing. They inhabited visually the styles and characteristics of the media and the culture that they talked about. And so I wrote a lot and I enjoyed reading a lot. And I loved listening to music, and all those things solidified ultimately around graphic design and magazines. And that was my primary interest, really. And then I went to university and got the opportunity to design a magazine. And that's when I just totally fell in love with the form. And the reason for falling in love with it was because sounds so pedestrian, really. It was just about the ability to communicate to people and to reach an audience and to see your ideas in front of people and to see how your ideas upset and interacted with people. So those are the sort of the motivations that led me to ultimately get a job at The Guardian, because that magazine that I designed at university, we won a magazine award for, and that gave me an internship, and that was where my journey began, really. And again, being very, very lucky to be dropped into a media environment that was reasonably well financed back then and was stable, and it was at the core of kind of conversation. And newspapers still represent, particularly in the UK, actually, still represent a kind of a hefty part of the conversation. But it was an incredible place to understand, to learn, to be around. The thing about newspapers is you're surrounded by the smartest people. You cannot help absorb their intellect and their ideas and their enthusiasm and their cynicism. And it was just an incredibly intoxicating environment to be around and to be able to learn through that. I mean, I did other things at the same time. I did a couple of other magazines around the same time, but ultimately The Guardian was where I stayed most of the time. And then I got a job at Bloomberg to do Bloomberg Businessweek.
How did that come about?
At The Guardian, I was agitating for a promotion from my boss at the time. And the only way really to get his attention was to get another job. And this is a couple of years prior to Businessweek. So I got a job working, even a job that I never intended to take, by the way, but I just was doing it for leverage. I got a job at Time, the European edition of Time magazine, which was then creative directed by Arthur Hochstone. Now, I never interviewed with Arthur, but in order to get that job, I had to send a PDF of my work to him. And Arthur liked that work so much that PDF didn't leave his desktop, apparently, for 2 years. And then a couple of people from Time went to Bloomberg bought Businessweek, and asked Arthur who they should talk to in terms of redesigning it. And Arthur said, there's this guy. And so this PDF that had been sitting on Arthur's desktop that I'd sent to him about 2 years before was the thing that totally changed my life. And moving over here to do that job, I never really thought I'd get the job. I was up against Luke Heyman, I think, at the time. I think I was up against a couple of other people. And I thought, I don't think they're going to give me the redesign, but maybe they might need a creative director to do it. So maybe there's an opportunity here to just get my foot in the door. I wasn't fantastically interested in doing a financial magazine at that point, but I was very interested in moving to New York. That was a huge motivator, the primary motivator. And I got along with Josh, who was the editor, who was another ex-Time Inc. person. And we were of a similar age, and we just bonded quite quickly. And much to my surprise, they offered me both the job and the redesign, literally in the car back to the airport. So that was the story. I was probably at The Guardian about 2 years out of a very big redesign that I'd worked on with a guy called Mark Porter. And so I had a lot of knowledge about redesigns because that process had taken, I think, about 2 or 3 years to do that. And even though I was only in my early 30s, I knew what to do. I knew that process pretty well. So I think that must have given me some chops there that they picked up on. And so in a very short amount of time, I ended up moving to America, to New York with my family, and really my life changed then.
Were you given carte blanche at Bloomberg? Because it went from being, I don't know, something you may have looked at if the story was good to something you had to look at if you were at all interested in interesting looking magazines. And sometimes I just thought, how is he getting away with this?
I think it took about 6 months for us to actually know what to do with that magazine. We came in, we did a very quick redesign, and I think it took us a good few months to understand actually what we'd done and what we were doing. But no, we weren't given carte blanche. But what we were given, and what really was the sort of the secret behind the scenes juice, was the fact that Bloomberg didn't know what they were doing. Bloomberg didn't have a playbook for how to make a magazine. And that was the secret sauce, because if that magazine had been bought by Hearst or Condé or something like that, then they would have had a process which they would have imposed on it. And it honestly probably would have been a more successful magazine in many ways. But because Bloomberg didn't have any kind of institutional knowledge on how to do this, they just had some kind of the wherewithal to buy it and fund it. We were allowed to experiment in ways, or we were allowed to think about that magazine in ways that the other sort of publishers wouldn't have even considered. Another aspect of the behind the scenes is also that Josh only reported to one person. He reported directly to Norm Pearlstein. And if Norm liked it, then it happened. So they managed to cut out all that kind of bureaucracy. And I very vividly actually remember we redesigned in April, and it was a bit hit or miss, and the covers were a bit of a struggle. And then I think in October, November, we just hit our stride, and there were 3 or 4 covers. One of them was this illustration of a Coke bottle. And I felt that there was a little bit of momentum, but really what happened is that things started to coalesce and kind of fall together towards the end of the year. We did those 3 or 4 covers in a row, which were all just a bit different, and that gave us something of a roadmap to what we ended up doing for a couple of years, which was just reasonably provocative. We removed all the cover lines from the cover, made a few moves like that, which just tweaked it, or tweaked us into kind of understanding what that magazine and what particularly the covers maybe could do. But then once we got that, I think we just had the wind beneath our wings, and there was just this sort of energy that pulsed through the team of people we had there. And we really were still operating in a little bit of an echo chamber of our own making, in terms of we were really only thinking if we liked it, everyone else liked it.
At that time, when I was looking at the covers, I was just, here's an example of a crazy Brit unleashed in America again. And especially once you hit things like the airline cover. I used to edit an in-flight magazine, so I was very attuned to stories about airlines. The merger cover, it was so cheeky. That's when I noticed you guys for the first time. It's like, oh my gosh, look at this. When you left Bloomberg, The Atlantic did a thing about your best covers, and there's not much of that happening, like media celebrating other media. I think other media wrote about you because in a way they were jealous of the freedom you guys had.
Yeah, I can't really talk to that beyond it being nice to be on the receiving end of that sort of attention. Again, you have to remember that I was still something of a fish out of water. I think I did about 4 years at Bloomberg, which probably wasn't even a full 4 years. Everything was new to me at that point, and nothing, I don't want to claim complete naivety, but you're right, I can see that kind of point of view. So it's just been an incredibly generous project to me. It did totally changed my life, and very unexpectedly as well. I moved over here really to move over here. I was always interested in finance. I much prefer money and finance as a way of understanding the world rather than politics. So the FT is my paper of choice. I've always had an interest in money and how it moves and how it works. But it was never something I thought I would necessarily be designing for. And I think retrospectively, we weren't exactly mood boarding this shit, but we were marinating in meme culture a little bit before other people. I think a lot of the covers that we did, that we had some successful with, were quite low fidelity ideas. They didn't have the high gloss finish that a lot of magazines did at the time.
Some of them felt like street art. Like I'm thinking about the hedge fund cover, which is another very cheeky cover, and it's really simple. Once you get the idea in your head, it doesn't take long to do it.
Yeah, and I don't want to say we're necessarily looking at street art, but we're certainly looking at images that were circulating on the internet at that time. There was another one that I did, which was this bang your head here, which is frustration about the euro at the time. That was just a literal copy of a meme that was floating around. I think that was somewhat new at the time, and I had a kind of a frustration with American magazines. Not frustration, but I saw what Americans magazines were doing at the time. And this is like the era of Fred Woodward and Scott Dadich, and this very high polished, incredibly baroque, very complicated, for me, overworked approach.
In 2014, you said, I think most American magazines are pretty terrible.
I still think they're pretty terrible. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I had an opinion about it. I preferred a slightly more direct graphic design approach, if you like, a more direct sort of aesthetic, and I still do. And that's what Businessweek was. It was just very direct. It was very quick. We didn't labor a lot. Once we had the idea, we just hit print. We didn't overthink too much. It was first thought, best thought. Sometimes as a consequence of just the timing that it took to do a weekly magazine. Any production process that you have, you essentially spend half the time doing it. That magazine was put together effectively in about 3 days. You didn't have a ton of time to overthink. It was really just very instinctive thinking.
So then you really changed your career and you went to MTV And then from MTV, you went to Wyden and Kennedy, an ad agency. I mean, MTV, you were redoing a lot of things there, so I could imagine it was the challenge. But what did you learn there?
Well, you said the word learn. I mean, that was the reason I did both of those things, to learn. I was in a very lucky position to be able to be paid to learn a ton of stuff. And so my impulse to go to MTV was the fact that at that point, video was becoming incredibly important in terms of the types of media that magazines were generating. And so I thought the best place to learn to do video and how to make things move was a TV company. It was really as simple as that. It was just, I didn't see a long-term future for myself in magazines at that time. I'm still shocked in some ways I'm still doing magazines, honestly, because back then I was just thinking this road is closing, we're running out of road. So there was an impulse to just to get out while I could and keep a career going, or to understand that my career had to change at that point. So I was in this very lucky position in both of those places of having a lot of power, but not really knowing very much. When that principle, which is for those some studious Tibor Kalman heads will know, is a direct quote of his almost, like the state of creative bliss is having power and knowing nothing. Both of those sort of situations were very, very instructive for me, both in terms of the things I learned and also the things I made, because I didn't really know what I was doing. You're not adhering to the rules quite as much because you don't really know what the rules are. And I think in both of those instances, the work that I did there was informed by that sort of quite blunt naivety. But to answer your question, it was a learning process, and it was sort of spotting the fact that if I didn't change my career, then I don't know if I would have had a career. It wasn't just a purely creative kind of impulse. It was just a financially driven impulse. It's just like, if I want to keep on in work, then I'm going to have to learn some new skills.
Ad agencies are their own worlds, and the agency world has its own rules. So how did you find the agency world?
Difficult is the truth. The agency I went into, Wyden Kennedy, is very highly thought of, and they thought very highly of themselves. They really felt that they were doing kind of God's work somehow, and they had
agencies too.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think Wyden, though, is particularly bad for that. Individually, everyone's very nice, but collectively, it's the beast, that thing. They have a big head office out in Portland. And when I got there, they wanted me to move to Portland, and I had no intention of moving to Portland. So I got situated in New York, and there's a lot of kind of going out for wings on a Friday night type thing. And it was a very masculine, very kind of bro, but not particularly creative place. And I just struggled. And the thing that saved me was that I found some commonality in the London office, obviously, because I'm English. I think they understood where I was coming from. And they had this project to redesign Formula One. So I got pulled over to the London office for the best part of a year to do that redesigning kind of Formula One project. And that saved me in terms of mentally, just giving me something to do. And once I'd done that project, I was just like, fuck it, I can just leave, I'll get fired or whatever. Broadly, it wasn't really working out at all.
Project is famous. It's famous, and you can read about it. And you had quite a good time, I think, at the end with the F1 logo.
Yeah, it was a really good project. I mean, it was just a lot. But you know what? In fairness to that process, and in fairness to everything, and in fairness to myself, it was just an incredible learning opportunity. Because I was senior, I was being flown all over the world, and that was fucking amazing. And I spent a lot of time in Japan and India and Brazil and places, and so I got this kind of world view, which I hadn't had before. I was also exposed to marketing people, and I was exposed to CMOs, and I was talking to, so that was something that I'd never seen before. So going there was an incredibly instructive, informative experience where you just really, you understand how ideas move both through agencies and then how they intersect with marketing departments. So it was a very useful and interesting kind of experience just to understand how all those pieces of our corporate puzzle work. And I got exposure to that on every level, from the kids right at the bottom who are initiating the ideas to the people right at the top who are signing off on those bigger ideas. And so that as a sort of learning experience was just incredible. So that plus the sort of the Formula One thing was the reason I stayed so long. I think I stayed there about 4 years. But it was equally, it was such a kind of like a weird situation where I was underworked. It didn't really have a role or a function, and I was just sort of existing within that company just because they could afford to keep me. So I took on two completely separate jobs. I was essentially moonlighting two jobs at the same time as doing that Wyden Kennedy job, one of which was starting Civilization and then working at Interview. So I was actually doing two jobs by the time I got to the end of the Wyden Kennedy experience, just because I was pretty much not doing anything.
And then you opened your own agency. So we'll get back to the lessons learned from Wyden and Kennedy. But How did Interview come about? Did Mel Ottenberg give you a call, or how did that happen?
it's because of civilizations. You talk very fondly about that F1 thing, but it was, and I think fondly about it, but it was also very stressful. I was totally out my depth 50% of the time because I never rebranded anything, and I was just like rebranding like the world's biggest fucking sport. Do you know what I mean? It was like insane how I got into that situation, and so I was just living by the seat of my pants, really, just like making this shit up as I went along, and just like pretending I knew what I was doing. I had no fucking idea how to do it. I was totally inventing it. And so I got back to New York, and I'd helped out my friend Rod on a newspaper that he did. And I really enjoyed that. And it was just like, I can remember the time feeling like it was just like slipping back into a kind of like a pair of pajamas. It's just like, fuck, I remember this. I can do this. I know completely how to do this job. And it had been probably about 8 years since I'd really thought about designing anything. I'd probably done a few things in the interim, but like not really anything significant. So again, I landed back and I did this newspaper called Civilization, which was a big broadsheet paper, which was really interested in text and words. It was very oppositional to kind of social media at the time, and I wanted to do something that was entirely text-based. And I did that with a friend that I met at MTV, actually, Lucas, and we did that together. And that found its way to Mel. So Mel and the people there had a copy of Civilization, and that's how I got the interview job.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about Civilization is that it's where you start to really, you obviously always played with type, but you really start to play with type and the idea even of legibility, and then Interview just being the magazine it is. Very pure magazine in many ways, just word and pictures. And Civilization does the same thing. And I often wonder if that, before I knew you'd worked at MTV, I wondered where that came from. But then I was thinking, like, maybe that's MTV.
I think Civilization really was, yeah, like I said, it was about, at this time in my life, I start just to become a lot more interested in a lot of things at the same time. So it's quite hard to explain Civilization in a way. There's not an easy take on it. But the way I explained that project back to myself was that I was really just trying to create the same type of friction, addiction to using words as the people were finding on Instagram at the time. It's, like people get addicted to Instagram, people get addicted to social media and digital platforms because they're never quite sure what's coming next. And so it makes it very compelling because you're never quite sure what's coming next. So you keep scrolling. And not only are you never sure what's coming next, the position of those pieces of content often is very jarring. And it's actually a very jarring experience to navigate that kind of stuff because there is this necessary friction that happens between the two content types. I thought that was interesting. And then I thought that can you use that methodology for a traditional kind of media form such as the broadsheet page? So really what I was trying to do is just sort of attack a page using this kind of grid system that is in my head and not really ever expressed in InDesign or whatever. And so every piece of content there is situated next to something it shouldn't really be next to, or at least it's designed to increase the friction between the content types. So that's how I explain that piece of work to myself. It was about overload and frenzy. It was also about how the language that we're using on social platforms and how language was changing. It was becoming much more personal and much more poetic in some ways. And so I was interested in all that kind of stuff. And a lot of the kind of projects that I've done post-Civilization are just experiments, really. They're just their theses. What would happen if you did this? And I think Civilization was the first time I really did it explicitly as a kind of a piece of research of kind of what would happen if you did this. If you add N to X, then what would that look like?
We'll be right back.
At MagCulture, we're excited about the future of print magazines. Visit our website and find out why. Read reviews and interviews, listen to our podcasts, shop from our unique selection of international magazines, and book our live events. All available at magculture.com. We love magazines.
Print is Dead is made possible by the support of the Society of Publication Designers. The SPD powers the future of visual storytelling, setting the standard for editorial excellence and shaping the future of visual culture. For more information, visit spd.org.
A lot of your projects feel like antidotes to something or reactions or even like just thoughts come to life.
I think that's fair. I think
like
that's
just an idea, like what if?
Yeah, I think, yeah. And I don't know if this is the point you're making, but they're antidotes to corporate work that I'm doing at the time as well. There are places to hide whilst I'm doing something I don't particularly enjoy doing. That's fair because I enjoy doing most things. But the frustrations and the pressures of corporate work where, the value system that is attached to a piece of corporate work is very different from a piece of media, for example. And so I'm able just to the play and the experimentation is a good, to use your word, it is a good antidote to often a lot of stuff that's happening elsewhere in my life.
You once said, maybe there's such a thing as too much good taste. New ideas are rarely found by a bunch of people who know what they're doing. Perhaps the more experience you have, the less you're able to see. And I think a lot of your work reflects that. It's brand new and we're going to try something and damn the rules.
Yeah, I forgot that I said that. It's interesting hearing those words read back to me, but let's stand by that. Also, I'm lucky. I'm somebody who just gets approached to do something. I genuinely have opportunities that are not often afforded to everybody by virtue of reputational stuff and being easy to Google and shit. Do you know what I mean? I do understand that I'm coming from quite a privileged position saying this, but I do get the opportunity to fuck around. Do you know what I mean? I take those opportunities to relearn and to just to try and fuck with the process. It's something I saw at Wyden a lot, actually. It's incredibly process driven. And I think there is a formula. There's a way of working that spits out a logical kind of conclusion. But I think we're so cursed at the moment by enterprise tools such as Google Slides, mood boarding. It creates a certain sort of methodology which dictates not only the creative process, but it really dictates the outcome even before the process has begun, quite frankly.
You've just described basically how I was going to enter into a discussion about Awful magazine, which is the reaction to a lot of things. You're using Microsoft Word to create the entire magazine.
I should just point out that all of that design was pretty much done by a woman called Julia Schaefer. I think it was probably my idea to do it in Word, but then she actually did it in Word. That was a really good collaboration with her, and I just very much need to say that out loud. That I created the conditions for that magazine. Like I said, let's just do it in Word. And it's Word output as a PDF, then output jigsawing a PDF around an InDesign page. That's the kind of the process of that thing. But again, it is a good example of kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face or tie one hand behind your back, because if you can't use the tools in the way that they need to be used or that they're requiring to be used, then you've at least got a better chance of there being a different outcome at the other end. When it's such an obvious point, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who's thinking about this on a daily basis. I know I'm not the only person thinking about it. It's kind of a preoccupation of mine. In order to get something that feels new and feels different, you have to think about its production differently and not just fall into established patterns and behaviors, which is hard because like the processes create efficiencies, and it is easier to do something the way we've done it 25 times before. Of course it is. But again, it's funny to say about T-ball again. The first time you do something, you get it wrong. The second time you do something, you get it right. And the third time you do something, you repeat yourself. Now, I think that's a bit too much of a distillation, but I think there's a real truth there. And I think Google and these enterprise tools, Apple and Keynote and things like that, they think they're doing us a favor creating these efficiencies. And to a certain extent they are, because they bring lay people into the process and they make strategists and designers and writers out of all of us, which is probably a good thing educationally and from a knowledge point of view. But for people who are actually in the creative businesses and in the creative arts, you have to find ways to fuck with them. And you have to find ways of finding new paths through. Because if you don't, you get where we're at the moment, where everything looks like Chobani or everything looks like Supreme. And, it's the machine. It's a totalizing machine.
We all become users as opposed to creators. We're all using the same things. So a few years ago, you launched an agency of your own, a creative agency, Food.
Yeah.
I don't want to ask why, but I'm going to ask why did you launch that?
Mostly it was because of this guy called Ian. Ian is the person who brought me into the Formula One job. He worked at Wyden Kennedy and he left and said, I think we should just start working together a bit more officially. And an agency was the most logical way of framing that. I think another way of framing it was just it's three friends messing around together. We're fortunate enough to be able to be mature enough in our lives to have connections and to be able to generate work. And it's a place where we can work collaboratively, hang out together and figure some stuff out. And it's a good house for us all. We're not trying to solve some kind of creative agency problem. Do you know what I mean? We're not setting ourselves up for scale much, really. We're not trying to be the next big agency. We are interested in working together, and it's a relationship based on friendship as much as anything, as well as speaking very regularly and talking and collaborating and supporting each other's ideas. It's a kind of highfalutin way of framing it, of thinking about it, but it's the truth.
And so after that, I guess the next magazine on the list is Nuts.
That's a food project. So we all have our own interests within food. Ian is builds AI models, and he's a creative technologist. And the thing that he fiddles within his shed late at night are AI models and just making the computers do. I don't even know what he does, really, quite frankly, but he seems to enjoy it. My thing is magazines and print and paper. I still work into, obviously, and Nuts was an opportunity just to think about fashion and clothing and the things that we wear somewhat. That was the impulse to do it. And we do projects for clothing brands and luxury companies like LMVH and Dior and Mulberry and places. And so we get thrown these kind of projects. And in addition to that, I'm engaging with fashion and clothing on a pretty much a daily basis, working with interview. And so Nuts was informed by that. To go back to this kind of add N to X principle, it's what happens when you collide clothing and fashion and the things that we wear with a sort of a narrative and blend those two forms together. And you do it at scale as well. We're just about to finish the second one, which I think is even longer. The first one was about 400 pages. The next one is going to be 500. And so,
holy cow.
Yeah. And that's the process. We just done Rolling Stone, by the way. Do you know that? We just redesigned Rolling Stone.
I had no idea. I knew this was going to happen. I knew you were going to say something that I had no idea about. Tell me about that.
That kind of came from Nuts again, weirdly. Now, this is one of the benefits of doing these kind of strange projects, these weird, sort of oddball publishing projects. They attract weirdo publishing people. One of the women who worked at Rolling Stone came to pick a copy of Nuts that she bought. And we got talking, and she was the deputy creative director of Rolling Stone, and they were just about to pull the trigger on a redesign or something. They were very seriously considering it, and then I was passed on to Gus Wenner, the CEO who runs Rolling Stone. So it came out of that. It came out of a chance meeting and a chance conversation, which kind of spiraled into a really great piece of work. We literally just got it back yesterday from the printer. So it's been about a 6-month process on and off.
You're talking about an iconic title that has been through a lot. Downs, ups, downs. And so what was the brief for that? What did they want?
It was very open. There was never really a statement of work or a scope particularly. It was just, what do you think we should do with it? It felt like my taste was more at the center of the decision making than perhaps other projects. The interview, which I'm still attached to and very fond of, that, like, my taste dictates the way that looks. And I think I was probably able to spin the way I think about what I want from a magazine. Look, an interview really was what I wanted the magazine to be. And I looked at that, I just thought we could just get rid of the front of the book, we get rid of the back of the book. All I really care about is the pictures. So let's just put the pictures at the center. And then when I went to Rolling Stone as a consultant, I would just say, look, I think you need to put more words in this thing. You need to bring it back. You've got tons of journalism that's happening on the internet, and they produce like 50 pieces of content a day. And I didn't think it was reflected well enough in the magazine that people buy. So that was the mission there, which was almost the exact opposite to what I do at interview. Just throw more words at it. It's just, we just need more. You need to go back to those where the ideas around content being front and center. You look back at those Rolling Stone magazines, it was really dense. And so the job there was to find kind of a new version of that type of density. So that's what we did, really. We upped the point size. We arranged the whole magazine around the body copy, essentially, which sounds obvious because isn't that what you're supposed to do all the time? So we just made it, we really made it a reading experience. And I joked at the time that I wanted to feel really smart, because it is smart. It's a bait and switch, that magazine. They put Shakira on the front, and then they write about Trump and Snapchat sort of deaths and all the evils of the way. And it's a really interesting kind of bait and switch. Just like the New Yorker puts a nice pretty illustration on the front and then just hits you with like mountains of words. He's definitely not the New Yorker. There's no kind of commonality there at all, really. But that was the mission for me. It needs to get serious again. It needs to dial down some of the... You picked up on it before. There's a sort of a theme in my stuff, which is a bit more about being productive and removing some of the idiosyncrasies and the detail and almost like the obsession with graphic design. That's something that I think obsesses American media, American magazines. So it's a much more kind of direct magazine. Sorry, I'm spiraling around here. It's actually the first time I've really talked about it. But the other big move is that we put it on like newsprint paper. So it's a magazine that has this kind of toothy, quite heavyweight newsprint, which just honestly is.
Which is where it was at the beginning too.
Exactly. What we're trying to do with that thing is just exactly what me and Mel do with interview. We're creating a kind of a false history for it. When you pick up interview now, I think there's an assumption that it's always, not ignoring the Fabian years, it's always looked like that. And that's not true at all. It's never really looked like how we do it. And that was a really interesting thought process for me of just creating these kind of fictional narratives or these fictional histories. And with Rolling Stone, I think if it's successful, then it will be a while before we know if it's successful, because redesign is one thing, but going forward is a different thing. I think the thing is people looking at it and thinking, God, it's always looked like this.
So you say interview, it's still interview. You open it up and of course it's evolved, but it's interview.
Yeah. This is actually something that I've done tons with in my career. It's just like taking these old products or these old brands and reviewing them in some form or other. You know, I mean, pretty much every single, apart from the ones I do myself, almost every single project I get is some kind of renewal kind of brief. And interviews are no different. You're trying to find the DNA, right? This is all kind of corny and boring, but you're trying to find the soul of the thing. You're trying to scrape away the bits that don't really work anymore and to reveal its essence. And sometimes that's an excavation exercise, and you really do have to dig hard. But both Interview and Rolling Stone were just very straightforward. Interview, it needs to be about the pictures. It needs to be more fun. It needs, sorry to use your word again, it needs to be an antidote to traditional media. It needs to be a breath of fresh air. And so we need to reintroduce the fun. I mean, Interview was definitely going through this weird Zoolander phase where it was all very high fashion, taking itself very seriously. And that was not the Andy Warhol that me and Mel responded to or had any affinity to. So that was very much the essence of what we do with Interview. And then with Rolling Stone, which is actually a magazine that I have far less of an experience with, quite frankly, because growing up in England, we were always aware of Rolling Stone, but I can't remember ever seeing a copy of it until really I came over here.
England has a very robust music press. And so when you were growing up, because you mentioned this way at the beginning, what were the magazines you were reading?
Oh, Dazed and Confused, The Face. And there's a magazine called Trace. The Guardian was really good back then. And lots of music magazines, which weren't actually particularly well designed, but there's one called Music, Mix Mag. Q, which actually was quite well designed. I did lead design on that one. I think what would be described as the style press, where I really made sure I never missed an issue, was Dazed and The Face, particularly those two.
Having been in this game for quite a while now, and then creating or recreating or redesigning sort of iconic magazines, working at them, what is a magazine today?
Good question. I think if you're going to be really sort of like gnarly about it, I really reduce it to elements which is not the most romantic ideals of what a magazine is. I think a magazine is an advert, the consolidation of the kind of id of your magazine brand. It's a place where you can, how did I describe this the other day? So it's not just a showcase, because I think that really undermines the power of these things still. But it is a sort of this living advert that people find on that people can, do you know what, honestly, as I'm saying all this, I'm not even sure it's true. Or, I wish I knew what a magazine was in 2024. I wish I do. I make magazines all the fucking time and I'm not even sure what they are. And I'm not even sure why I'm doing it. All I know is I just do it and I love it. And I love the fact that they are physical objects. And I think other people love the fact they are physical objects too. I wish I had some kind of pithy take. I'm sure if you're talking to like Scott Dadich or someone, he would just be able to surmise this in a much more fluid way, or some kind of like big editorial thinker. But like ultimately, it's pictures on a page. It's ideas that kind of live in a way that don't quite live in digital means. It's a place where a certain sort of consumer can play, you can perform for, without wishing to big up this Rolling Stone thing too much. I brought it home yesterday. My wife, who really isn't a big magazine reader on any sort of level, she picked it up and she read a 5,000 word story. I was not expecting that. And I mention that only because it was quite gratifying that we've done something that someone actually read. Most of the stuff that I do, people just like flick through. But it was also a reminder that there is just a different pace that magazines have, and a different cadence to those who want to entertain it, that they exist in our lives. And it's not for everybody. And I struggle sometimes to really find the financial value in throwing money in these things. But for whatever reason, they're still going. Interview, for example, would not be Interview without the magazine, the print magazine. Most of the money Interview makes is by using branded integrations and by putting fancy clothes on big stars and TikTokers and exploiting the reach of talent and celebrity, and that mix of brands and celebrity and talent that is very toxic, very potent. Nobody would be interested in Interview if it wasn't for the fact that we do a magazine. And I don't understand that. Like, there isn't a logic to that. We deliberately make Interview quite hard to find. We're not trying to be in every single Hudson News or whatever. It's not for everyone. It's for you. If you seek it out and you want it, here it is for you. But But for whatever reason, without those pictures, which we have millions more eyes on the internet, without the print magazine, people wouldn't be interested in what we do. Go figure.
Words on a page, whether that page is a rock or anything else, enduring, they last. Okay, we always end with 3 favorite things, media or magazines right now. What are your 3?
FT. I read the FT every weekend. So that's the thing that I love the most, that I look forward to the most in terms of reading. Does it have to be print media?
No, it can be any media.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I've been designing posters for a place in the Lower East Side called Earth, and it's a space that's been set up by a couple of Berlin artists for literary performance and spoken word. And I've loved some of those things. We saw Tao Lin a couple of weeks back. So I think live, just being in a room jam-packed with tons of people, talking, listening to ideas, performance. I love that. I'm just going to say it out loud, cookery shows. I really enjoy watching cookery shows on the TV. I can watch people cooking.
Anyone in particular?
I think my heritage is more English people, English shows. That's this guy called Rick Stein. I enjoy. I like this guy called Nigel Slater. I could just watch people cooking.
I love Nigel Slater. I have his books.
I could watch people cooking all day. I find that very kind of therapeutic. And this, as a sort of a little bit of a build on that, I still watch a lot of Bob Ross. I really do. I know it's corny, but I could just seeing someone paint like that, it's just so relaxing and so just captivating. And even though he says the same thing over and over again about his happy little clouds and all that, we've got to make some decisions.
There's something poetic about you liking Bob Ross, because on one hand, a lot of your work looks contradictory, but you've said yourself that you're a boring traditionalist, formalist thinker. And Bob Ross kind of ties that all up really well.
Yeah, I love Bob. I love tradition. I like traditional people. And craft is to be celebrated as well as destroyed. Craft principles, but you have to know the rules to break them, as they say, don't you?
Yes.
It's been a while since I've picked up a paintbrush. Maybe, you know what, maybe I'll do the Bob Ross method when I retire. Maybe that will be how I spend my day. I'll paint some seascapes and happy little mountains. I'll be down with that.
This has been the Full Bleed Podcast, a series of short conversations with the people creating the magazines of the future. The Full Bleed is a production of Magazium, and this episode was produced by Patrick Mitchell. My name is Arjun Basu. Thank you for listening. Now go consume a magazine in the platform of your choice.
The Full Bleed Podcast is a production of Magazium and Modus Operandi Design. For more information, visit our website at magazium.co, where you can read complete transcripts of all of our interviews, along with portfolios, archival photos, links, and other great information. And be sure to visit Entry Points, our new blog, all about the world of magazines. Follow us on social media at We Are Magazium or at Print is Dead Pod. And please give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Thanks very much for listening.